have today we have Jeff Cramer, who is our resident. He's the Curator of Collections in our library, and he is just an incredible Thoreau scholar. He is a wealth of knowledge. He has written or edited about a dozen books on Thoreau and Emerson, and he is ready to answer all of your questions today. So I have kind of collated or categorized the questions that came in advance into a few different groups so that we can kind of stay on a theme for a little while and then move on. And those are some more biographical questions about Thoreau, and then a couple questions about his writings themselves and his writing process, some questions about his ideas or philosophy, and then some, because people are always interested in this, Jeff's musings about Thoreau's influence on us today, or how Thoreau might fit in today. So that's kind of where we'll go. Sarah, my colleague, who will introduce herself in a minute, will be minding our chat function. So if you have a question during this, you can use the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And so send that question either to everyone or to Sarah Walker, so we can incorporate that into the conversation. We do ask people keep themselves muted, and you can use the reaction button if you want. So the thumbs up or the applaud, if you want to give some feedback while the session is going. This is being recorded because people have asked us if we'll record it and post it later. So that is happening. So if you want to turn off your video camera, the intent is for us to focus only on the speakers in our recording. But if, just to be careful, you want to turn off your video because you don't want to be on it, feel free. All right, so Sarah, I'll have you introduce yourself, and then Jeff introduce himself, and then I'll launch in with the questions.
Great. So I am Sarah Walker. I am the Education Programs Assistant at the Walden Woods Project, as well as the Communications Coordinator.
And I am Jeff Cramer. I am Curator of Collections at the Walden Woods Project's Thoreau Institute Library, where I have been for over 20 years now, quite a while. And I've edited, as Whitney said, many books on Thoreau and Emerson, including Walden, a fully annotated edition, the portable Thoreau, the portable Emerson, and most recently, Solid Seasons, the friendship of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. So I'm looking forward to answering your questions. If you stump me, the screen will go black for a second, and we will claim a technical glitch, so you'll understand what's going on. So we'll open it up to questions.
Great. So we'll start with that category of more biographical questions that folks are wondering about. And let's start at the very beginning. Someone was wondering if we know what time of day, Thoreau was born.
We don't. So we're going to start out with the first question that I can't answer. So there's no record that I'm aware of as to when Thoreau was born in July of 1817. People have tried to do astrological records and charts, and some people have come up with a 9 p.m. time. I don't know if that's a standard time if you don't know his exact time, but really there is no record saying when he was actually born.
Okay. I like that we're starting off with one that we don't know for sure, because that, then everything else just goes.
It's got to be uphill from now.
So also, growing up, we'll kind of move through his years. Could you talk about his relationships with his sisters, especially Sophia, who also shared his love of the outdoors?
Yeah, so the Thoreaus were a very, very close-knit family. The parents and Thoreau and his 3 siblings, Helen and John, died fairly young. So for most of Thoreau's adult life, it was Thoreau and his sister Sophia. But they were all very close. They all shared a love for nature. They kept records of birds and things like that, and went for walks outdoors and things such as that. But they also had an interest in abolitionism, and so Thoreau himself was greatly influenced by his family, particularly the women in his family, his mother and his two sisters, in relation to things like not only nature, but also abolitionism. So there were a lot of things that we think of as so Thoreauvian that they must have originated with Henry David Thoreau, but a lot of the things in his life and the things we're really familiar with, the inception comes from elsewhere, and then he grows with those ideas.
And you mentioned there the common abolitionist ideals and commitment that he had with his sisters and other family members. So that relates to another question that someone sent in related to kind of who he was interacting with in that time. So he went into Concord during the time that he was living at Walden Pond. Do we know how many times he went into town? And this person is asking about having read that he hosted an abolitionist meeting at his cabin, so also the visitors to his house.
Yeah. So Thoreau had a lot of society while he was at Walden Pond. He went into town almost every day, partly to go to the post office where he'd pick up the newspaper, which he did read devoutly, no matter what he says in his essays, also to visit with family and with friends. So if you think about the fact that he was there for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, he probably went into town 600 or more times. That's a lot of walks into town. But also people would visit him there. Emerson came out, Bronson Alcott came out, I think it was almost every Sunday. There are various people that would visit him along the way, including some strangers who walked through the woods and heard that he was there and might knock on the door, not necessarily be welcomed by Thoreau, but that they came to see. And there was the women's anti-slavery movement held a meeting there in which there were, I forget the exact number of people, but there were a lot of people who were there that day squeezing into his small house.
Great. So kind of continuing on this theme of the society that he did have and ways that he interacted with other people. So he went to Harvard. So someone is asking about when he was there, if he graduated, what his degree was in, how old was he, and if he lived there.
Okay, so yes, so he went to Harvard
questions.
in 1833, graduating in 1837 with a bachelor's degree. He was there for 4 years, but he actually took about a year off to teach. I think it was his third year he took off, partly to get some money to go to Harvard. It was not expensive compared to going to Harvard today, but for a middle-class family, as the Thoreaus were, it took some doing to have the money for Thoreau to go. So he was there for 4 years. Yes, he graduated, and he didn't love his education at Harvard. He didn't think it was the best. He talked about it had all the branches of knowledge, but didn't teach any of the roots. So he felt it was not the kind of education he really truly wanted, but it served him well. And when you graduated from Harvard, you either became a minister, a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher, and Thoreau became a teacher. So it did help him in his career as an educator.
And kind of, again, related to the places he went outside of Concord, someone had read that he had a library card for a time at the Boston Athenaeum. Did he ever live in Boston? If so, what years and why? And I know this is related. So this is a question someone else submitted, but did he ever take a train?
Okay. So yeah, basically he didn't really live in Boston. He lived in Cambridge when he was at Harvard College. And he didn't really have a library card to the Boston Athenaeum. People became members, and it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who was a member of the Boston Athenaeum, and Emerson was an extremely generous person. And so he would borrow books for Thoreau from the Athenaeum or allow Thoreau to use his borrowing privileges. So Thoreau did borrow books from the Athenaeum through Emerson, and he also borrowed books from the Harvard Library, which he petitioned to be able to do by writing a letter to the president of Harvard College, saying that he should have the right to borrow books from the college, which he also got permission to do. He did take the train. So when the train came into Concord finally in the 1840s, it was something that allowed him to get into Boston and Cambridge at a fairly quick speed compared to walking. And so he did use the train. He did take it when he was helping escaped enslaved persons get north. Again, he would use the train as a method of transportation to help that person escape to freedom. So we should just talk for a second about his relationship with the train, because people think of Thoreau as some kind of Luddite who did not like technology or improvements, and that's actually not true. So the train, if you think about it, was a tool. Nothing more, nothing less. It was something that he could use to do something such as get into Boston at a quicker speed. So for that, it was good. It caused some destruction, which he did not appreciate. It caused a lot of noise, which he did not appreciate. But he also was not against any kind of technology. And the train is one of those, the big thing that was happening in his day. And one of the things, just quickly, was that what he saw even in his day, and we see it certainly a lot now, is how much technology runs our own lives. And when he was growing up, farmers used to tell time by the sun, by the position of the sun. And what he found is when the train came into Concord, farmers actually set their timepieces by the train. The train came in at 2 o'clock through Concord. It must be 2 o'clock now. And they lost that touch with nature, and that he didn't like.
One more question here on the biographical stuff about him before we see if anyone else has submitted any, is just about his own personal library. So we've asked about, the books he would borrow, but what was in his own personal library?
So we don't know all the books that are in his library. I mean, we have lists that people compiled from various information, and we know some of the things that are in his library. There's a book by Robert Saddlemeyer called Thoreau's Reading, which compiles everything we know that Thoreau read and where they might have been. So a lot of the things that were in his personal library now at the Concord Free Public Library. So we have a sense of those books. They would have his signature in them. But he had a decent library, as well as, besides borrowing privilege at the Athenaeum through Emerson or the Harvard Library, he also had complete access to Emerson's library, which was huge. And so he had access to a lot of material.
Excellent. All right. Sarah, anything else come in on kind of this, the more biographical?
Well, yeah. So did Thoreau communicate and stay in touch with his family when he was, I'm assuming from this person means when he was living at the pond?
Yeah, I mean, he was close. He'd go home for dinner. He would visit with them. They might visit him. The first night that he spent at Walden Pond, his mother, for some reason that I don't understand, was extremely worried about him. I don't know if they thought he was going to be attacked by some wild animal in Concord or whatever. And so she sent Sophia the next morning to quietly check on him and make sure he was okay. But yeah, they remained very close. And he would also help out at the family pencil factory and do various things. So yeah, he was constantly in touch with his family.
And on that note, in regards to his relationships, a lot of people characterize Thoreau as a misogynist. Any chance that you, Jeff, would write about his relationships with his sisters, his mom, and also on that note, if you could go into his relationship with Margaret Fuller a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm just trying to answer questions fairly quickly so that we can get to a lot of questions today. So if I don't answer things as fully as you like, feel free to email me or contact me. So a lot of people do consider him a misogynist. He truly was not. He was a person who did not suffer fools lightly and did not like people wasting his time. So he will talk to, or would talk to anyone if they were able to engage in a conversation that stimulated his mind. So you had to be an intellectual person who could offer something in exchange in a dialogue. And so there were women who could do that. Mary Moody Emerson, Emerson's aunt, Margaret Fuller, lots of people in the Emerson Thoreau circle in Concord. what he didn't like was anybody who couldn't have a conversation. So to him, it didn't really matter if you're male or female, white or black, whatever it was. The important thing was that you could have a conversation. And so, yeah, he does say some somewhat demeaning things about women, because most of the women he knew, outside of people like Mary Moody Emerson and Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Peabody, were women who spent more time about their appearance. And he said very clearly he didn't understand why anybody would talk to a woman merely because she had good features. It didn't make sense to him that one would do that. So those kinds of statements sound misogynistic to people who really don't dig deeply into what Thoreau was talking about. He had an interesting relationship with Margaret Fuller. They didn't get along that well. The Margaret Fuller had, when she was editing the Dial, had rejected one of his pieces. Thoreau was sort of adopted by Emerson as the great next, writer, intellectual, whatever. And Margaret Fuller just did not see that in Henry David Thoreau. So there were some issues, but they got along well enough.
Did you dodge the question about whether you would write about this?
Oh, I'm sorry. I know I forgot the question already. So at the moment, there are no plans about that, but that would make an interesting topic. So who knows? Just check online in a couple of years in your favorite bookshop, and we'll see what happens.
If you haven't read Jeff's books, they are incredibly enlightening. It is like reading, I always say, multiple texts at once. It's like reading a history book and a biography and a Greek mythology textbook and religious texts. And oh, look how many thumbs up we're getting on that. A lot of people agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if he did choose to write about Thoreau and the women in his life, it would be fantastic. All right, Sarah, any more on this kind of topic, or
there's
are we ready to move?
So there's some good, so I see everyone's questions about like resources for after this, so we can actually come back to those at the end. There is a fun quarantine question too for Jeff. We can ask that at the end if you want, Whitney, if you have.
Okay. So we'll keep moving through kind of the categories and then throw them in where they seem to make sense. And if there are any that kind of don't fit into those, we can just, do those at the end. Okay. So kind of moving on to Thoreau and his writings and his writing process. So kind of technical question about his writing process. Do we know what tools he wrote with or what he wrote on? Did he have a store of Thoreau pencil, company pencils that he used, or what paper surfaces did he write on? And where did it come from?
Yeah, so strangely, he didn't write with pencil, despite the fact he probably had a really good deal on Thoreau pencils. He wrote in ink with a quill. So quill and ink. So most of his manuscripts are in ink. He often corrected in pencil, which I think is an interesting thing to do, to write in ink and correct in pencil. He had paper of varying sorts, nothing consistent. There was a stationer's in Concord from which he bought his paper, but there's no consistency in that he used a particular kind or whatever through his career. And you can often tell when he was writing by looking at the paper. He was using this paper in 1847, he was using a different paper in 1849. So when people study his manuscripts, they're actually able to tell, for the most part, when certain parts of the manuscript, like Walden, was written using the analysis of the paper. And so that was his main way of writing. He kept a journal. He wrote in field notebooks when he was out in the woods, not in his journal per se, but in field notebooks. He just bought cheap notebooks that he could get again at the stationers. So nothing very consistent.
And I do know, kind of as a follow-up on that, one of the questions that we get asked often is if any of those field books still exist.
Yeah, and virtually they do not. There's a few scraps around, but mostly they're gone.
The journals, however,
are pretty extant. Yeah, there's a few parts of the journals that were, in his early days, Thoreau would cut and paste like you do on your computer. So he would literally use a knife and cut out parts of his manuscript and move it and paste it somewhere else. So his earlier manuscripts are cut up quite a bit. his later manuscripts, very little has been cut out of them. If something is cut out of a later manuscript, it really makes you wonder what he had said on that page that made him cut it out at that point.
Yeah. Okay, so then to kind of, well, more about his writing process, I guess. So someone was commenting that he's very intentional with the titles of his chapters. So taking specific ordinary words and changing the reader's perspective on them. Why, if we know, or if you have thoughts on it, why did he pick the words he did for? And I'm thinking this means for the chapter titles, but words in general too.
Right. I mean, and I'm assuming in particular, we're talking about Walden, where he has those kinds of chapter titles where he often played off of certain things. So a lot of the chapters in Walden are sort of pair off with the next one. You have, you know, things like society and solitude. You know, so you have things that he talks about one thing and he talks about the opposite thing in the next chapter. He was very, very careful with his word choices all throughout his writing, not just in chapter titles. He often looked at the original meaning of words and the ideas behind them. So there's a lot of depth to his word choices, I have found. And so one has to really be kind of thoughtful about what words meant to Thoreau in his day. When I did my work on annotating Thoreau's works, for instance, I would only use resources that Thoreau could have had access to. So if I wanted to know the meaning of a word that Thoreau used, I didn't look it up in a dictionary, I looked it up in his dictionary, because that gives you a real true sense of the kinds of things that he was thinking about when he chose the words he chose.
It is, I mean, you doing that work for the annotated versions of things is so helpful, because there are times when a word actually means, I mean, something that's almost opposite as it does now.
Definitely
And
something different, yeah.
yeah, and it changes the whole meaning of that excerpt. And so just love that you did that. All right, Sarah, any questions coming in for you on his writing or writing process?
None about that.
Okay. And if people think of them, you can still send them in. We can always come back to this as a topic. But so kind of moving into the more philosophical questions. One, do you think Thoreau ever considered money more than just a means to an end? Or in other words, did he ever covet or amass any financial gain? His relationship with money.
Yeah, I mean, money he knew was practical because he knew you couldn't barter for everything. And he has very clear passages in Walden about that. But no, it was just something you needed to use to function in society. He didn't covet it. He didn't love accumulating it. He didn't like it when he had, like when he found money one time in his desk, I believe it was an annoyance because what do you do with it? How do you spend it? What's it there for? He only earned what money he needed to earn. He was kind of in an interesting position that way where he didn't feel it was necessary to accumulate money. If he needed it because he was going to travel somewhere or need to buy something, that is when he would work to earn that money. So no, he didn't covet it. He was not your typical person who wanted to have all sorts of wealth to help them get through the gates of heaven or whatever it takes to get up there, or however it works. I don't know. But no, he didn't accumulate it.
And this one, from money to love. So this one is based on a quotation that someone is attributing to Thoreau. So truth is greater than love, which is also commenting on if that is accurate, an accurate quotation. But either way, did this revelation, truth is greater than love, or something similar, occur before the Ellen Sewell rejection or rebuffing of his proposal? And do you think his failure in love turned him toward the inviolability of truth?
Wow.
Yeah.
So the quotation, and despite the fact that I edited the quotable Thoreau, I am really horrible at quoting. So, and I should have thought about this ahead of time. So there is a quotation, basically, more than love, more than money, give me truth, something to that effect. So that, I believe, is what the person's referring to. And I don't think it comes out of his rejection by Ellen Sewell when Thoreau proposed marriage to her. I think it's part of who he already was at that point in time. But truth for him was always the goal. That was the ultimate. And more than anything, I think it was important for him to feel that in his relationships with people, that there was a truthfulness between them and an honesty, which made it so difficult for Thoreau to have the kind of friends that he really wanted, those ideal friendships that sometimes were impossible for him to attain. So yeah, but I think it didn't necessarily stem from Ellen Sewell's rejection. I think it was just part of his makeup at that point.
And I'm wondering, because there are probably people on this call who are familiar with the Ellen Sewell story and some who are not. So we could take a little soap opera break and have you tell that story so people are familiar with it.
We'll do as quick a version as I can.
Yeah.
So the Thoreau family took in boarders in the Thoreau family home, and there's a woman named Prudence Ward who was a boarder there. And one summer, her niece, Ellen Sewell, came to Concord, in part to visit the aunt, in part because her brother was going to be going to the Thoreau family school. But she came, she was 17 years old, and both Thoreau and his brother John both fell in love with her. And so the time she was there that summer, they wooed her, taking her out on the river, taking her out on the pond, Thoreau playing his flute for her, dancing, doing all sorts of things to entertain her. And then she went back home to Scituate, Mass. And Thoreau decided, being the younger brother, that he would step aside and let John marry Ellen, as if Ellen didn't have any say in this matter. So John went down to Scituate, Mass to propose marriage, and they were walking along the beach, and there were some chaperones, and they got away from the chaperones, and John proposed marriage, and Ellen said yes, and they said, no, sorry, no, I can't marry you. She changed her mind very quickly, and John came back to Concord very dejected. And despite how much Thoreau loved his brother, he wasn't quite as upset about it as John was, because now it was his turn. But Thoreau, being a bit of an introvert and socially awkward, the idea of going to Scituate and proposing marriage in person to Ellen was beyond his capabilities. So he wrote her a love letter proposing marriage. The letter doesn't exist anymore. I can't even imagine what a love letter by Henry David Thoreau proposing marriage would have in it. It just boggles the imagination. And Ellen did something that she didn't do when John asked. She asked her father if she could marry Henry, and he said, no, basically you can't marry transcendentalists. They have their heads in the clouds, can't support a family. No way is my daughter going to marry a transcendentalist. So she had to turn him down. Her letter doesn't exist either, but right afterwards she wrote to her Aunt Prudence, saying the letter she just wrote Henry, turning him down, was the hardest letter she ever had to write. And the reason that it was so hard is because she did not want to lose his friendship. They were very good friends. And so they actually remained friends for the rest of Thoreau's life. She married a minister named Joseph Osgood. They had 4 children, and Thoreau became friends with the husband. They would walk on little excursions together with the children. And so they remained in touch for the rest of Thoreau's life.
Great, thank you. And I do see a comment on the chat to everyone that I think does have to do with his philosophy about talking about how Thoreau did help enslaved people or people escaping enslavement, because how he did that is related to his ideas about how to help the world, the effective way to do that.
Yeah, so Thoreau helped people on an individual level. He didn't believe in large movements. He didn't go to large abolitionist movements in Boston or do any of those things for the most part, although he did host a meeting at his house at Walden. For the most part, he helped people individually. So in Thoreau's mind, I think it was probably next to impossible that he could do anything that would end slavery. However, he could help individual enslaved people who made it to Concord. As part of the Underground Railroad, the Thoreau family house was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And Thoreau himself, as we know from certain records, took care of the person. So they would live up in the attic where he was living in the Thoreau family home. He would bathe their feet. He would feed them. He would get them clothed. He would make sure that they were healthy enough to travel. And so he would then buy tickets on the train to go back to the train thing. And he would accompany the person on the train, and they would start heading north. And if he felt there were no slave catchers around, which there were those days, he would hop off the train and walk back to Concord while the person made it to freedom. And he did this many, many times. And so it was the way he made a difference in the world. When, for instance, the Irish were in Concord, and they weren't that welcome in Concord society. They were traveling through to build the railroad. They were poor. They were uneducated for the most part. There was a local family living not far from Thoreau at Walden Pond, and there was a young boy who probably wouldn't have survived the winter because he didn't have warm up clothing, and Thoreau bought him a coat. So this is his way of helping. Again, not the large issues, but the individual. And that's how he saw things. It was through those eyes of a person looking at another person, an individual.
Great. And we know a lot of people look to Thoreau for how to make change in today's world. So look to his example of how to do that and what's effective. And so it seems we could transition into kind of where he would fit today, or how his ideas apply to today. But Sarah, I want to, are there any other questions that have come into you on kind of just his philosophy alone and not necessarily bringing it into today yet?
Just one question that popped up about the people that he helped. Jeff, did he write about those people anywhere?
He didn't. So if you were helping an enslaved person, it was against the law to help them. I mean, there was the Fugitive Slave Act. And so, no. So most of the people who were helping didn't actually write about it, because you wouldn't want a record that you helped this person. But there are records that people told later through oral history. Edward Emerson did a lot of interviewing of people about the abolitionist work in Concord. So there's some oral records that were happening. Thoreau was visited by somebody who happened to come when there to be an enslaved person in his attic, and described the scene he saw in a later book, in one of his autobiographies. So there are records, but not any through Thoreau himself.
Great, thank you. So something Thoreau did write a lot about. There's a question that kind of bringing us into how we can use Thoreau as an example for ourselves. Talking about Thoreau's comments about simplifying and how we can be better at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do I want to say this? So in my head, simplification is so easy. You just simplify and we're done. And there are lots of very complicated books on how to simplify, and go to the self-help section in any bookstore or library, and there's lots of books about all the things you have to do to be able to simplify, which again makes no sense to me. Thoreau would think about the importance of things, and also the repetition of things and such. So we tend to overcomplicate things. So let's just look at the news. Let's look at the virus we're suffering from right now in the pandemic, and all the people that spend their day checking the news 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 times a day. I'm getting very stressed out to try to keep track of things. And Thoreau thought that you shouldn't keep repeating things. So you shouldn't keep reading the newspaper. If once you learn something, you've got it. You don't need to keep seeing multiple examples of things. So let's say we're in this pandemic, which we are, and we are self-isolating. Okay, and if you're self-isolating in your house for however many weeks you're going to be there, you don't actually need to check the news all the time, because you're not going out there. You're going to be staying inside, you're isolating, you need to isolate. So there's lots of things that people are doing that are complicating and adding stress into the issue. For Thoreau, I think if he were in this situation, and I'm just guessing because I don't actually like to say this is what Thoreau would do if you're in the situation, but I think in essence, if Thoreau was, once he was here saying, I am self-isolating in my home, then what he would do was think about what's important to him. whether it's writing, whether it's reading, whatever those things are that make his life feel fulfilled. So rather than thinking about what's out there and the things that he's not accessing or the things he's not able to do, he would think about what can he do, and think about how important those things are. We're all in this situation where I think we're all looking at all the things we can't have, all the things we can't do, instead of looking at the things we can do. And Thoreau was pretty much an optimist. He looked at the silver lining of things. I mean, he saw the good, even in bad situations. And that's something, again, that can help us simplify. What are we able to do with that? We're probably doing without a lot of things right now. So how are we doing with that? We're probably all doing fine in our different ways. We might grumble that we don't have this or that, but we're probably doing fine. So the big question then becomes, when this is over, are you going to stay in that sense of what's really important, what's not important, or are you going to go back to the way you were a few months ago? These are just thoughts about how Thoreau would handle some things. Yeah, let's stop there, go to other questions, and I'll probably come back to this theme.
Well, and so I'm going to go to another question and then kind of add on to it something that I know others have asked you. So someone is wondering where Thoreau would fit in today's political, educational, and social world. And I know that I've heard you say it is so difficult because the world is so different in so many ways, but there are some similarities. So this person teaches Thoreau on transcendentalism and has an assignment where students have to research a person and then propose where they fit in to today's society. And they find it interesting that most of the students see Thoreau as a libertarian, very fiscally conservative and socially liberal is kind of where they put him. So this person is looking for your thoughts on where you see Thoreau fitting in the 21st century world to be able to respond to those students.
Yeah, I mean, it is, as you were saying, it's so hard because we're in such a different world than Thoreau experienced in the 1840s and 1850s. And libertarianism certainly offers some of the ideas that are expressed through Thoreau's writings, but I think overall it's difficult to sort of pigeonhole him into one of those groups. If we look at libertarianism as something that sort of maximizes individual freedom and minimizes government interference, yeah, absolutely. But Thoreau absolutely believed that we need government. So he was never a no government type of person, and knew that there were times when government needed to interfere with our day-to-day existence. So, if he were here now and had to practice social isolation because of the virus, yeah, he might grumble about not going for his walks, or he would go for his walks out in nature in places where he's not going to meet another person. I was trying to think about this because this has come up in questions on our Thursdays with Thoreau meetings. And I realized there's a bridge in Lincoln, Mass, not far from the Walden Woods Project, is Baker Bridge. And during Thoreau's time, Baker Bridge, he called it the murderous Lincoln Bridge because the way it was built, this bridge and its closeness to the tracks, people were getting killed. Particularly people who worked on the railway, they'd be doing something and the bridge comes and bang them on the head and boom, they're dead. And this happened quite a lot. And so Thoreau was trying to think about, well, what could be done to fix it? And his answer surprised me because he said, this would require but a little resolution in our legislature. So he's looking at the government to create some kind of resolution or law or something that would force the railroad and how it to change things. So he's not against the idea of government interfering when it helps save lives and protect people. So you can relate that particularly to what we're going through today. So a lot of people pull up Thoreau's name as, oh my God, he would not like what's going on. He would not like the government saying, hey, stay in your home. But he would also understand. He would also understand that sometimes the government has to, and that's what it's there for, interfere for the greater good. So, if you look in the news these days, Thoreau's name is being pulled up all over the place to defend certain positions. But the one that I think people are really missing is that occasionally Thoreau said, yeah, government, it has to do this because it's protecting all of us, and that's what it's there for.
And that's related to another question. So you've talked about kind of his response to government's role in a crisis like today. And someone else is asking if he would have lived through a global pandemic, such as COVID-19, what might his words of wisdom have been?
Wow. Yeah. So, gosh, this is a hard one because it's he would have words of wisdom, but people aren't going to necessarily like them. So through anything that was happening, Thoreau saw change, and saw change as not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but just as a different thing. And so through whatever was happening in the world, what he saw was the change that came. So whether it's invasive species that might wipe out something local, whether it was the fact that Native Americans were being virtually wiped out in his day, things like that. What he's said, and it sounds cold in a way, but that it's bad for whatever is being destroyed, but there's also good that can come from it. There's change and difference. So I think if he survived a pandemic like this, he might look at, yes, we've had horrible amounts of deaths and we've had tragedy and all sorts of horrible things that come from it, but he would also look for what is the good that can come out of it also, and what are the things that can change the way we as human beings interact with each other, interact with society or government. How do we use our purchasing power? What's going to happen to the economy? And all of those things this is the pause, and this is what Thoreau would use it for. This is the pause that makes us think about how literally we are spending our lives, and what are we going to do with our lives, and what are we going to make different about how we live our lives, so that when the pandemic is over and we are recovering and changing and maybe bettering, or do we just go back to the status quo? So the words of wisdom would be to just try to figure out what during this period of gestation or rest or isolation, what are the things that are so important to you as a human being, and how you interact with your friends and family and neighbors, because you're interacting in such a different way now. And what does it actually mean?
Thank you. I love that, because I see so many people thinking about, when we come out of this, what kind of place do we want to be, and what kind of people do we want to be together?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I do have one more question here from the ones that were submitted early, but I think that's kind of a good wrap-up question. So Sarah, I'm going to throw it over to you to any other kind of, not random, but various questions that have come in.
Yeah. So we'll start off with the fun quarantine question, and then we'll go to some resources people are hoping you might have, Jeff. So if you were to choose between Thoreau or Emerson to be in quarantine with, who would you choose?
That's great.
Oh my gosh, Emerson, hands down.
And that's Karen.
Yeah, Emerson was a kind person. He was a little emotionally cold, but he was a kind person. And if you were stuck with Emerson, I think he would be a good person to be stuck with. He'd have a conversation with you. You would feel welcome with him, versus Thoreau would probably make you feel like you don't want to be there. It reminds me that there's a quotation that I use all the time, written by a friend of his, basically, Elizabeth Core, who said, "I love Henry, but I do not like him." And I think that is such a perfect summation of how people interacted with him. So no, I would not want to be quarantined with Henry.
And kind of on the contrary to that, how has your life been impacted, Jeff, by spending 20 years with Thoreau as a companion?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, it's 20 years with the Walden Woods Project. It's a lot longer with Henry as my companion. So I'd say it's impacted my life in the way that the thing I get most out of Thoreau is not answers. And this is what people go to him for wisdom and answers. I go to him for questions. I love the fact that Thoreau is constantly questioning everything around him, including concepts we think of as Thoreauvian. And so he is constantly thinking and reevaluating his life all through it. And not just taking it as this is the way I do things. It's like, why am I doing it? And what difference does that make to the people around me? And can I change? Can I do something different? And how will that affect the people around me? So, I like to think that the thing have gotten most out of reading and spending so much time with Thoreau is the idea of just questioning what I'm doing and hoping that I'm slowly, very slowly becoming a slightly better person than I was the day before.
Hmm. And then as for the resource questions, do you have any kind of adult learning, college level, online Thoreau classes that you know of that people could
I
possibly
don't. I mean, we at the Walden Woods Project, we have talked about developing one. We haven't gotten that far at this point in time. So at the moment, no, I don't know of any online Thoreau classes. Keep checking back. There could be one soon.
Great. And this is from Sarah, whose class I believe was supposed to come to Walden Woods this spring. Any books for middle school students that you might recommend in preparation for a trip to Walden Woods?
There, and the bad part is I'm not going to remember the titles of these books. So, but there was a wonderful middle school book, biography of Thoreau, through his years of before he went to Walden, and it's really a wonderful book. And unfortunately, I cannot remember the name of it, so I'm really embarrassed. But if you email, I can get it for you. The author is Michael Sims, but I don't remember the title. It's a wonderful book, and that's a great introduction to Thoreau's early years prior to Walden. So I think that would be a good thing. But also, it's hard to say. I'm not good at what is middle school, what's not. I mean, reading a biography of Thoreau, and there are some wonderful biographies out there, all slightly different. I think reading any of them would be a great introduction to who Thoreau was.
And I think someone had asked this question before too, Jeff, about readings for middle schoolers. Did you recommend poetry before, or am I thinking of something else?
You might be recommend Thoreau's poetry, do you mean? Or
yeah, I thought there was a book of poetry that you once recommended, but
gosh, no, I never recommend Thoreau's poetry.
Okay.
It's
Never mind then.
Yeah, he was a great prose writer, very mediocre poet. He wrote a couple of really good poems, but for the most part, I would not recommend his poetry to anyone.
Okay, well, that's a good question that I asked then.
And Jeff, is the book "The Adventures of Henry Thoreau: A Young Man's Unlikely
Yes.
Path to Walden Pond"?
Yeah,
okay.
That's a great introduction. That's a great book.
I think that's Whitney for the any
Marcia said yeah.
Any other
there was one more that actually I think is an interesting kind of next to the question of a book about middle school. So someone had asked about his boyhood friends and what boyhood adventures he did experience and if he ever got in trouble.
Yeah, so we don't know a lot about his boyhood and his youth, and Michael dug up a few things in his book, but he had a fairly normal boyhood. As he got older, he did get in a little trouble. He burned down in the woods with a friend of his by accident, completely by accident. There was a drought, and a spark from a fire that they built to make a stew caught and spread very, very quickly beyond anybody's ability to put it out. But overall, no, I mean, I don't know of any incidences in his youth that got him into too much trouble.
Okay, so I think that was it on the chat to everyone, Sarah, and all your questions have been asked? Yes. Okay, great. So the one final question that I think is a good wrapping up point, and I know this is a question to Jeff Cramer and his opinion. And actually, I think, as we're kind of doing our closing thing, and it might be interesting for people to just put a few words up to what they would say to this in the chat. But what is the most important detail that Thoreau brings to the modern age?
I guess the most important detail is that, and for me, Thoreau was a person always trying to better himself, and through that, because he believed in self-reformation, better the society around him. And so I can't think of anything that is more important in grasping out of all of Thoreau's writing, because they're all really about this, than the idea that we should continually work to being better human beings, better neighbors, better friends, better members of society, and work towards that end.
Great. A great place to end. Yeah, and if people do want to share, great. Some people are. That's excellent. Share what they think the answer is to that question. And this timing is working out perfectly because we had hoped to wrap up by 2 for everyone. And I think we are out of questions for now. And we just have a few more minutes to go. So thank you all so much for joining us. This has been just one of kind of the different virtual offerings that we have been trying to make available to people during this really challenging time. We are so glad that you all have joined us. We may or may not do this again, or may do something similar but different. We do have our Thursdays with Thoreau, though, which have been excellent conversations, more interactive, so everyone there gets to contribute and interact. So look on our website for that. If you haven't yet participated in that, our next topic this Thursday is spring, and then after that, living without regret. And yeah, we just thank you all so much for spending some of this time with us. We do remind you that we are a nonprofit, 30 years old. We want to have more years ahead of us. So if you can support us right now, we would really appreciate it. We know that not everyone is in a position to do that right now. But yeah, and enjoy your day. And I will leave it open for a little while so that if you want to keep commenting or have another question. Also, if you want to go more in depth in any of these topics with Jeff, definitely email curator@walden.org. Anything else, Sarah or Jeff?
No, just it's been wonderful chatting with people. I love the questions.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about some things in different ways, even after 6 years. I love this today. It was so great. I loved it. So
I loved your connections with I know those questions are the hardest, but with the now, especially the whole news thing, I'm going to keep that in my head.
refresh. No, don't do it again. All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.